3 words. That is all it takes. 3 words from an officer, and most Americans immediately reach into their pocket, pull out their wallet, and hand over the one document that hands a stranger with a badge complete access to their identity, their address, their history, and in some states, the legal justification to detain them further. Show me your ID. It sounds like an order. It feels mandatory, and almost every driver in America treats it exactly that way automatically, without hesitation, without asking a single question. But here is what should genuinely shock you. In many situations, you are not legally required to show that ID at all. And the moment you hand it over without understanding when you have to, and when you do not, you have already made the mistake that changes the entire encounter. I am Marcus. On this channel, I break down the real law behind real police encounters, so you know exactly what to say and what not to say before you ever need it. Quick note before we go further. I am a legal educator and commentator, not your attorney. This is education, not legal advice. Laws vary significantly by state. For your specific situation, always consult a licensed lawyer. Now let me show you the trap inside those 3 words and the exact response that keeps you legally protected no matter which state you are in. Section 1. The assumption that gets people every time here is the assumption almost every driver carries. If a police officer asks for your ID, you have to give it. Full stop. No question. Just hand it over. And here is the reality. That assumption is wrong in more situations than you think, and officers know it is wrong. Some of them are counting on the fact that you do not. Let me give you the actual legal framework, because this is where most channels stop at the surface, and where I am going to go deeper. There is no single national ID law in the United States. Whether you are required to identify yourself to a police officer depends entirely on 3 things: which state you are in, what type of encounter you are having, and what legal status that officer has actually established before making the request. Get all 3 of those factors wrong, and you may hand over your ID in a situation where you had every legal right to ask a question first. Here is the number that matters. As of right now, roughly half the states in America have what are called stop and identify statutes. These laws allow officers to demand identification when they have reasonable suspicion that you have been involved in criminal activity. Not a hunch, not a gut feeling, a specific, articulable, legally defensible reason. The other states either have no such law or have much narrower versions of it, which means, depending on where you are standing when that officer says, "Show me your ID," your legal obligation is either clearly defined, completely absent, or somewhere in the middle. And here is what officers almost never tell you, if this is already changing the way you think about that request. Stay with me, because what comes next is the specific situation where handing over your ID without asking anything first costs innocent people the most, and it happens every single day. Section 2. The 3 situations and how each one changes everything. The law treats ID requests differently depending on the situation you are in. Let me walk you through each one clearly. Situation 1. You are driving and you get pulled over. This one is straightforward. When you are operating a vehicle on a public road, virtually every state requires you to produce your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance when lawfully stopped. Driving is a licensed privilege. Those documents are conditions of that privilege. In this situation, hand them over. Calmly, clearly, without argument. But pay close attention to what you are handing over and what that does not cover. You are producing documents related to your operation of that vehicle. You are not opening a conversation. You are not answering questions about where you came from or where you are headed. The documents are the legal requirement. Everything after that is optional. Situation 2. You are a passenger in a vehicle that gets pulled over. This is where it gets important and where most people make the biggest mistake. If you are a passenger, not the driver, the legal standard shifts significantly. The Supreme Court ruled in Maryland versus Wilson in 1997 that officers can order passengers out of a stopped vehicle. But ordering you out of the car is not the same as legally requiring you to identify yourself. In most states, a passenger does not have an automatic obligation to provide identification during a traffic stop, unless the officer has independent, reasonable suspicion that the passenger specifically has been involved in criminal activity, not the driver. You, specifically. If an officer approaches the passenger window and says, "Show me your ID," the first thing you are legally entitled to ask, calmly and respectfully, "Is this, officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That question is not rude. It is not an obstruction. It is the exact legal tool that forces the officer to declare what legal basis he is operating on. And it should be the first words out of your mouth before your hand moves anywhere near your wallet. Situation 3. You are on foot walking, standing, or stopped somewhere in public. This is the most misunderstood situation of all. The Supreme Court addressed this directly in Hiibel versus 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada in 2004. The court upheld state stop and identify laws, but with a critical condition. The officer must have reasonable suspicion of criminal activity before he can legally demand that you identify yourself. A police officer cannot walk up to you on a public sidewalk because he feels like it and legally compel you to show ID. He needs reasonable suspicion first. And here is the fact that changes everything about how you should respond in this situation. Reasonable suspicion is a legal standard that the officer must be able to articulate and justify. It is not a feeling. It is not a profile. It is not the neighborhood you are standing in. It is specific observable facts that point towards specific criminal activity. Before you hand over your ID on a street encounter, you have the right to ask calmly, respectfully, "Officer, are you detaining me right now?" If he says no, you are free to walk away. And you should. If he says yes, then you are being detained, which means he believes he has reasonable suspicion. And in a stop and identify state, producing your name and potentially your ID may be legally required at that point. But the key is, you asked first. You did not just hand it over because 3 words felt like a command. Section 3. What happens when you just hand it over? Let me show you what automatic compliance actually costs people. Picture a man named Dennis, 58 years old, retired teacher. He is walking to his car in a parking lot after dinner with his wife. An officer approaches, says there was a report of a suspicious person in the area, and says, "Show me your ID." Dennis reaches into his pocket without a word and hands it over. The officer runs his name. Dennis has a 10-year-old misdemeanor on his record, something minor, fully resolved. But it is there. The officer now has a reason to extend the encounter. More questions follow. A pat-down is suggested. What started as a 30-second interaction becomes 20 minutes of Dennis standing in a parking lot while his wife waits alone at the restaurant table. Dennis was not suspicious. He was not doing anything wrong. He was walking to his car. But he handed over his ID before asking a single question. And that one automatic reflex changed the entire trajectory of the encounter. Now here is the critical point I want you to hold on to. Dennis may not have had to show that ID at all, depending on his state, depending on whether that officer actually had articulable, reasonable suspicion, and depending on whether Dennis was truly being detained or just being questioned. He never found out, because he never asked. The question he should have said calmly, respectfully, before his hand moved, was this: "Officer, am I being detained, or am I free to go?" 4 words that change everything. Not because they are magic, because they force a legal declaration on camera before you make any decision about what to hand over. Subscribe right now if you are getting something from this you have never heard before. Because what I am about to give you next is the complete word-for-word response for every version of this encounter. And I want it in your memory before you ever need it. Section 4. Your exact response. Every situation covered here is your complete framework. 3 situations, 3 responses. In a vehicle as the driver. Hand over your license, registration, and insurance. Say nothing extra. If questions follow about where you are coming from or where you are headed, officer, I am not answering any questions beyond providing my documents. In a vehicle as a passenger. Before your hand moves anywhere, ask calmly, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" If he says you are free to go, you go. If he says you are being detained, ask, "What is the legal basis for my detention?" Let him answer on camera before you decide anything. On foot in a public place. Same opening question, officer. Am I being detained, or am I free to go? If he says detained, follow up with, "I want to comply with what the law requires. Can you tell me the legal basis for this detention?" In a stop and identify state, if he has reasonable suspicion and articulates it, your state law may require you to provide your name. Know your state. But you asked first. You documented it. You did not just hand it over reflexively. And in every single situation, no matter what happens, if he moves toward a search of your person or your belongings, you say clearly, "I do not consent to any searches." Say it once. Calmly. For the camera. That is your Fourth Amendment on record. Section 5. The one mistake that follows people for years here is the mistake I want to leave you with because it is the one that has the longest consequences. People assume that because they have nothing to hide, the fastest path through any police encounter is to give everything immediately and answer every question cooperatively. That assumption is not just wrong legally. It is the assumption that officers are specifically trained to rely on. The Supreme Court ruled in Schneckloth versus Bustamonte back in 1973 that officers are not required to tell you that you have the right to refuse a consent search. They do not have to inform you of your options. They can ask for things while knowing you have the right to say no, and they have no obligation to mention that right exists. The gap between what you think you have to do and what you actually have to do is exactly where rights get lost. Not through force, through assumption. You assumed you had to show the ID before asking whether you were being detained. You assumed that handing it over was the cooperative thing to do. You assumed the fastest way to end the stop was to give everything and answer everything. And the officer never corrected you. Because he was not required to. And because your assumption made his job significantly easier. The one sentence that closes that gap is the same in every situation. Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go? Ask it first. Ask it calmly. Ask it before your hand moves. And then listen carefully to the answer, because the answer tells you everything you need to know about what your legal obligations actually are in that specific moment. Before you close this video, send it to one person who drives. One person who has never thought about any of this, because the next time an officer says those 3 words to someone you care about, the difference between knowing this and not knowing it can be enormous. Subscribe to Marcus Your Rights Explained. Every week I give you the real law, the real cases, and the exact words before you need them. Hit the bell so you never miss it. Because the officer at your window is counting on your assumption. After today, you have a question instead. Stay calm. Stay firm. Stay polite. I am Marcus. I will see you in the next one.